I chair the APPG on African reparations, and I've long called on the UK government to engage in discussions around reparative justice. And I've said time and time again that the issue of reparative justice is about just that, justice. It's about more than handing over money. It's about addressing the structural inequalities that colonialism created and still perpetuates, changing those global structures that keep the global south in the situation it is. And those inequalities have been instrumental in creating the debt that we're discussing today. It's about addressing disparities that are starkly evident in the fight against climate change, particularly in the context of our international financial system, which is quite frankly a relic of the 20th century. Worsening droughts in East Africa and tropical hurricanes in the Caribbean, tsunamis in Asia show how Britain's former colonies remain disproportionately vulnerable to the frontline effects of crises that they did little to cause. Not only did we engage in colonial crimes, we remain a leading historic emitter. The UK could take responsibility by reframing reparative justice within the context of climate justice. We could fund large-scale restoration projects, compensate for biodiversity loss, and help nations to adapt to climate change. This form of reparative justice could be removing the burden of debt that is preventing these countries from fighting the climate emergency themselves by building infrastructure to defend against some of the environmental challenges which, if we do not get our act together, will be permanent. Some of the world's poorest and most climate vulnerable countries are seeing their debt payments grow twice as fast as their climate support. They do not currently stand a chance. And when faced with extreme weather conditions, yearly deathly floods or droughts, they are forced to borrow more and more to support their people and rebuild their infrastructure, adding to the already insurmountable debt pile. In 2022, I joined a parliamentary delegation to Kenya with CAFOD and saw firsthand the impact of famine and drought on the people living in Marsabit County. Their agriculture and their livestock were decimated. The country had been decimated by one of the worst droughts in living memory. The situation that we all saw on the ground in Kenya brought home the devastating ramifications of the climate crisis and the inequities that it is rooted in, inequities that we benefited from and have sustained since. Kenya is not a notable emitter of CO2. It does not drastically contribute to the climate destruction. In fact, Kenya is responsible for just 0.03% of global carbon dioxide emissions today, and about 160 times less than the United Kingdom. And yet man-made climate change, of which the UK has historic responsibility for, is causing untold levels of destruction in that nation. And their debt crisis means that they, like many other countries that we've heard mentioned today, are unable to take meaningful steps to address it. In 2021, Kenya's debt repayments were more than 5 times the amount of money the government was spending on measures to tackle their climate crisis. They, like many other countries, are fighting this crisis with both hands tied behind their back. Countries in the global south will face an estimated $290 to $580 billion in climate-related loss and damage every year by 2030. Every single year. Now, at the start of the COVID pandemic, the G20 agreed a scheme to suspend debt payments for over 70 countries. But because private lenders were not made to participate on equal terms, countries that applied to the scheme had under a quarter of external debt payments suspended. As you've heard my honourable friends mention today, over 90% of the bonds owned by countries eligible for debt relief under G20 schemes are governed by English law. It means that they are under our control and we can actually do something about it. The UK could be playing a leading role in addressing the debt crisis instead of standing by as private creditors are bailed out. The government should be supporting efforts to cancel debts for all climate vulnerable countries with unsustainable debts by expanding the G20 common framework to include middle income nations and strengthen it to make sure that private creditors participate because we know, to be quite frank, that the situation for the average person in some so-called middle income nations is still dire. I also call on the government to enhance the UK's commitment on international climate finance overall and encourage other countries to do the same through a comprehensive financing facility to offer unconditional grants, not more debt, to countries facing climate disaster. and actually to push for automatic debt payment suspension and relief for countries in the event of a climate-related disaster, and introduce legislation to stop private creditors from suing those same climate-vulnerable countries. The UK's role as a major historic emitter, a former colonial power and current global leader, places a special obligation on us to put climate justice at the heart of our global response to the disaster we face now. And some people ask, why reparative justice and not simply aid? And that is because aid has not worked. And when a duty is put on people to do something, when they understand that they owe somebody something and it is a matter of justice, they are more likely to do it. And aid has become an industry. Aid in itself is something that is subject to supply and demand, and so many countries are not benefiting from it in the way that they should be. So we need to look at this as an issue of reparative justice, and we, the UK, have to pay what we owe.